Hey everybody, this is Dan, and this is week 6 of History 3380, and this week we're going to read about slavery. So we're still in that antebellum era, the era before the Civil War, for the most part. And I want to take a minute this week to address slavery and capitalism, and how these things relate, and also get into this idea of consumer activism, because I think there's a pretty good theme. We can talk about slavery and consumer activism all at the same time. So this week, again, we're in the early 1800s up to the Civil War, and there are 4 readings this week. And there's some module objectives. Of course, one of them is you should be able to explain how the North was involved in sustaining slavery. You should also be able to provide an example of consumer activism. You should know how today's globalism makes us all part of human exploitation, if you will. And you should also be able to explain intellectual property in the context of patent law, which you probably already can do because we've already covered intellectual property, but we're going to look at another piece of it today that's interesting. So these four readings all relate to those weekly module objectives, the stuff that you should know when you're done with this week. And the first reading is called How Slavery Led to Modern Capitalism, and it's a very short reading out of Huffington Post. And it's really interesting because it's a history that talks about how the North was invested in slavery in the South prior to the Civil War. And I think most of you already knew that, but maybe some of you didn't know that. But it's interesting because businesses often invest in things that maybe are considered unfair labor or are considered somehow dangerous to the environment. And as consumers, we don't always know that the businesses that we frequent, the businesses that we sustain, are involved in unfair labor practices, for example. So this is an interesting article because it talks about some companies that are still around today and how they were active investors in slavery prior to the Civil War. So that's one to read. It's interesting. Then the next one is called How the Patent Office Helped to End Slavery. And I don't really think the title matches. The article doesn't prove the title by any means, but it's an interesting read because it talks about the Confederacy, that's the government in the South during the Civil War, and how they had set up their own patent system. And there were a number of slave inventors that had patentable goods or patentable processes, and they weren't allowed to hold patents themselves because they weren't considered citizens. And so this idea of patents that slaves were responsible for coming up with, or at least inventions that slaves came up with that couldn't be patented in the South, is an interesting twist on what we already know about intellectual property. And it's a very short read, but I thought it was something that you would be interested in, so I put it out there, and I'd like you to read it. The third reading for this week is called Buy for the Slave, and it's an older article from an academic journal, and it's one I really liked. It's a great story because it talks about abolitionists and how a number of abolitionists, women especially, had set up free trade stores that sold goods, mainly in clothing and in produce that were not produced by slaves. So in other words, if they sold clothing, the fibers weren't grown, on slave-run plantations. If they sold food, it was food that wasn't produced by slaves. So this is an example of a real early consumer activism movement, and I think most of you know what consumer activism is, such as boycotts, or there are people that don't buy from Chick-fil-A because of their views on homosexuality, that sort of thing. Some of you buy free trade coffee, perhaps. There were people that didn't buy gasoline at BP after the oil spill in the Gulf. So I think you know what consumer activism is, but this Buy for the Slave article is interesting because it shows you that In the period of slavery, there were people interested in not supporting slavery through what they purchased. So go ahead and read that one. And then the last one really kind of drives the point home because it gets us back to the present time and illustrates one way in which we're all responsible for sustaining unfair labor or unhumanizing labor practices. So the last one is about a mineral called coltan, Coltan, and it's a little bit of an older article. Coltan is still used in some items, but most manufacturers of cell phones either source it from legitimate sources or have replaced it, but not all have. So it's interesting to learn how your cell phone, parts of that, the rare minerals involved, were those minerals were acquired, in places where there was tribal warfare and slavery. So in some ways, even today, especially with globalism, we all contribute to unfair labor practices, or at least give our business in some way to some way where people are being exploited. So it's an interesting article to look at, and not only coltan, but I think most of you know that many of the clothes that you wear, your cell phones and where and how they're assembled, those are all controversial work environments. So the Chinese factories where they make iPhones, for example, are staffed with with people that are not being paid very much money, that often work in dangerous or inhumane working conditions that we're not always aware of. So these things all tie together, whether it's the northern capitalist investing in slavery in the South, whether it is a cell phone that you have in your pocket, and the workers that put it together that are treated somewhat like slaves. This idea of exploitation of people and really consumer activism start to come together in this period of time. So it's an interesting aspect of business and consumerism, and it's a little bit of break from the business we were talking about, but I think it's something we need to be aware of, because as consumers, we are either all culpable for some of the wrongdoing in the world and globalization, but we also have a choice by what we buy and what we purchase to make our views known. In other words, not buy from people or not buy things that we don't believe in. So think about all that stuff, and we'll get together again next week and start to talk about the Gilded Age, which is the period after the Civil War. If you have any questions or need anything, please reach out to me. I'm always available. Thanks, and have a great week.